God, we are gathered together to try to pay attention to the ways that our feeble attempts to know you and to worship you and to proclaim your good news have been twisted and distorted in our culture toward other ends. Give us the gift of discernment, which can only come from you, to see through all the ways that we've been lied to and the ways we've lied to ourselves, so that we might worship you more truly and honor you in the way we live by your name in this world. Amen. Well, if you were with us last week or had a chance to review the video, we dove into a definition of Christian nationalism, for lack of a better word, by trying to pay attention to some of the sociological research, in particular that Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry have done to sort of create some categories to describe just the way people understand the relationship between Christian faith and the role of government, or the role that faith should play in public life. And we introduced that scale, but I think one of the important things that comes out of that research that Andrew was showing on the last couple slides in his presentation last week is the way that this myth of Christian nationalism, and I use myth there in the broadest sense, not pejoratively, but to say that this is clearly a story that is told to give people a particular identity, a particular meaning, and to create a certain culture. The myth and the way that it is told clearly plays differently in terms of what it actually means for people and what it leads them to do in the world based on how people are raced here in America. And I think that means that we can't take seriously the role of Christian nationalism in American public life without understanding its racist roots and without really trying to be clear about the role that race has played in Christian public witness throughout this nation's history. So that's what we're going to dive into today. The racist roots of Christian nationalism, try to move quickly from slaveholder religion to the religious right today. To do that, I wanted to start with the Virginia colony in the 17th century. There are other places we could start, but I often start thinking about this here because this is where I live. I live in North Carolina, but if you follow the rivers that run through Virginia and Carolina down to Norfolk and to Wilmington and to Charleston, South Carolina, along that fertile land that those rivers created, you have what some historians call the Virginia-Carolina Delta in the United States, and that is the land on which plantation capitalism was established. We've had some national historical remembrances of 1619 over the last year, the marker of the White Lion's arrival at Jamestown, that ship on which the first recorded enslaved Africans were purchased at Jamestown. And from there, and from no doubt some other sources, enslaved Africans became a part of colonial life in the 17th century, to the point that it becomes a part of the history of the legal code in these places. There's prior to the one I want to look at here today, there's the case of John Punch a couple of decades earlier, a man, an enslaved African man who ran away with two European indentured servants. And when they were all three caught and brought into court, they received different punishments for their attempt to escape their indenture. For the two men of European descent, they were given an extension of additional years they had to serve on their indenture. For Mr. Punch, he was given perpetual servitude as his sentence. And this begins to reshape the law in the Virginia colony to create the identities, separate identities of so-called white and black people based on the color of their skin. Pretty quickly after that, the Virginia Assembly has to rewrite essentially British common law on inheritance, because it is already a problem in the Virginia colony that where the British common law says that the child of a man is his son or daughter and his heir. They immediately recognized the problem that white men in this emerging plantation capitalism who claim to own black women do what they will with them and have children by them. And in that case, according to the common law, those enslaved children would be their heirs. But this, of course, doesn't work within this emerging system. And so they rewrite the inheritance law in the Virginia Assembly, again, before this instance in 1667. But by the time we get to 1667, this has become a religious problem, and a religious problem that not only the church, but the assembly itself weighs in on. So you can look at the language here from 1667. Whereas some doubts have arisen whether children that are slaves by birth and by the charity and piety of their owners made partakers of the blessed sacrament of baptism should by virtue of their baptism be made free, it is enacted and declared by this grand assembly that the authority thereof, that the conferring of baptism does not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom, that diverse masters, freed from this doubt, may more carefully endeavor the propagation of Christianity by permitting children, those slaves, or choose of greater growth, if capable, to be admitted of that sacrament. The language is a little arcane if you're not still reading the King James Version of the Bible, but the point is clear. The question that has come up is whether baptizing enslaved people and making them fellow sisters and brothers in the family of God doesn't require people to treat them differently. And this Grand Assembly, as they call themselves, weighs in and says, no, by no means. It's interesting that not only are they redefining what baptism means here in terms of the status of enslaved people, but it's also pretty clear that they're making a declaration about who baptism belongs to. Look in that early sentence where it says, by the charity and piety of their owners, they're made partakers of the blessed sacrament of baptism. All you preachers thought that by the authority given to you by God, you baptize people. But no, the Virginia Assembly says it's by the charity and piety of slave masters, of people who claim to own other human beings, that the sacrament is conferred to them. And it becomes a matter of law that this act of the church, this fundamental act of welcome into the family of God, doesn't change someone's status. It's a splitting of the religious significance of familial bonds and spiritual bonds in the body of Christ from ethical obligation in the world. And it is clearly a turning, a remaking of Christian faith to fit this system in which other people can be owned and their labor can be used and abused for the benefit of the masters. That's 1667 in the Virginia Assembly. But it's worth noting that this was not only happening in Virginia, it was not only happening in the South. Here is the cover of an essay that was printed in 1706, written by the most prolific author of his generation, the acclaimed cleric and son of one of the founders of Harvard University, Cotton Mather. And you can see the title is The Negro Christianized, an essay to excite and assist that good work, the instruction of Negro servants in Christianity. You see the clarity that the Virginia Assembly had gained about the fact that baptism did not in any way change the status of enslaved people, was fueled by this sense that the white slave owner, the white slave master, was not only in power over the bodies of these people, but was spiritually superior and had a spiritual obligation to share the benefits of their religiosity with those people whom they enslaved. And so it becomes an important part of piety for Christians, especially for Christians of some means in the 17th and 18th century, to share the faith, to instruct enslaved people in the faith, to be a quote unquote good slave master is to instruct your slaves in Christianity. It's laid out here in this essay as a kind of moral obligation by probably the not only most famous Christian writer, but the most famous writer of his generation. And the little epigraph there is an interesting one from Psalm 63. You might notice under the quote from John, there's a quote from the Psalm: Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God. Along with this notion that the benevolence of the white Christian slaveholder compelled them to share their faith with those whom they enslaved, there was also this emerging mythos that the white man's burden was to proclaim the gospel to the continent of Africa, right? So you have here people who had read their Bibles closely. I mean, I'm not accusing any of these people of being stupid. They had read their Bibles and read them closely, but had somehow missed that Philip had that conversation with the Ethiopian in the book of Acts, and that the good news of the gospel had gone back to Ethiopia and had been in Africa ever since. And in their own imagination, they read scriptures like Psalm 63 as a sort of prophecy that foresaw their slaveholding as a kind of missionary enterprise, right? That would even take the good news to those poor heathen souls in Ethiopia. They imagined that that would somehow happen in reverse through the slave trade and through the evangelization of enslaved people. So this gets hammered out in law, certainly in the Virginia colony, also in other places, but it also gets internalized into the theology, the faith, and the practice of the established churches of that time, North and South. This is not simply a Southern phenomenon. If we turn to the 19th century, I don't think anyone names the hypocrisy of this more clearly than Frederick Douglass, from whom we get the description of this novel and emerging faith in the Americas as slaveholder religion. Douglass says in his autobiography, "Between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I see the widest possible difference." Now, here is a man who was born enslaved in Maryland, was raised on land that was owned by a man who claimed to be Christian and to own the land and to own his family. He was instructed in the scriptures, right, by people who claimed to own him and his family. And Douglass, of course, fought those who enslaved him and eventually got away. And later said, I prayed for my freedom for 20 years, but God never heard my prayers until I prayed with my feet. Douglass had a clear sense that the Lord was not expecting him to wait for the skies to open for him to be set free. He had a role to play in his own liberation. He gets to the north, he joins the AME Church. Frederick Douglass is a churchman and a frequent guest in pulpits for the rest of his life. And it's very clear at the end of his autobiography that he is not in any way trying to criticize Christianity. Rather, he's trying to clarify that those people who have claimed Christianity as a justification for slaveholding have turned Christianity on its head, have betrayed the faith itself. And you see below here a quote that he often used in a stump speech that he gave that gets at the fire of his feeling, and I think a fairly accurate description of things as they were in his time. He said, a few heterodox and still fewer orthodox ministers filling humble pulpits and living upon small salaries have espoused the cause of the slave. But the ministers of high standing, the $5,000 divines, were almost to a man on the side of slavery. And so we see this clarity coming from Douglass, from the abolitionist movement, that there is no way that you can read the scriptures, that you can be faithful to the God of the Bible and claim to own other people. And yet, the people who adopt that are so marginalized that Douglass says they are often dismissed as heterodox, not following the true teachings of the church and of Scripture. And even if they're orthodox in their confession, he says they live on small salaries, because at the end of the day, Douglass is clear that money is driving this, right? It's the preachers who are dependent on the plantation capitalist system. And again, this is not just a system that supports the South. In the 19th century, as cotton becomes king, the Wall Street and the stock exchange is built on that cotton, right? This is the fundamental economic engine to the American economy, and it's based on the exploitation of people that has not only been allowed and tolerated, but has been justified by the use of Christian faith. That's the thing that burns Frederick Douglass up, and that has him turning again and again and again. If you read through his speeches, there's a great new biography a year or two ago by David Blight called Frederick Douglass. But if you go through his life, through his speeches, over and over again, he turns to those biblical prophets, to Isaiah, to Jeremiah, to cry out against what he sees clearly as a betrayal of the faith, a betrayal of the faith that has allowed the faith to be used for exactly the opposite of what it actually means. Well, Douglass is clear, and increasingly, more and more people were on the side of abolition. This, of course, has a lot to do with why the Civil War comes to be in the mid-19th century. This is why every major denomination in the United States splits in the middle of the 19th century. Whether you're Presbyterian or Methodist or Baptist or Episcopalian, there are fractures in every one of the established denominations at the time over the question of slaveholding. And in the midst of that, there are theologians, those $5,000 divines that Frederick Douglass talked about, who developed slaveholder religion with fury. They are well funded, both by their churches and by theological institutions at the time. Robert Louis Dabney, who is commemorated here on the little card that you can see on the right. I put this up here because I think it's important to see that some people even today still remember and venerate characters like this. He's quoted there from June of 1868, just after the war, as saying, "The man who has ceased to feel moral indignation for wrong has ceased to feel the claims of virtue." There's a kind of a sort of moral crusade that he ties to slaveholder religion. And I think this excerpt from a letter that he wrote on the abolitionists in the 1850s before the war is key to understanding not only the myth of a redeemer nation and the movement that would be called redemption in the 1870s and 80s, but also to understanding how the pattern of reactionary response from Christian nationalism has continued up until the present. Look closely at what Dabney says the strategy should be for those who defended slaveholder religion and wanted to push back against the abolitionists. He said, "Here is our policy: to push the Bible argument continually, drive abolitionism to the wall, and compel it to assume an anti-Christian position. By doing so, we compel the whole Christianity of the North to array itself to our side." Dabney is absolutely clear that the only way that he and those like him who wanted to defend slavery as an institution are going to be able to defend it is by convincing Christian people that the Bible not only allows it, but that divine providence is actually using it as that epigraph from Psalm 63 suggested, to further the cause of the gospel in the world. And so Dabney, from a sort of strategic position, says by tying the system as it exists to the Bible, and by suggesting that the Bible and the Bible's purposes are advanced by this system, we can force those who are trying to get rid of it to have a kind of anti-Christian position. You see, we'll call them heterodox, we'll call them socialists, we'll call them anti-God and anti-moral. And by doing so, we will compel even Christians who are not as directly dependent on this system, he's talking about the Christianity of the North here, we will compel even them to stand with us out of quote unquote Christian solidarity, because we've so tied this system to our Christian faith. It's a very intentional strategy that he and others worked out. Dabney, you can look on the card there, goes on to serve as a chaplain during the Civil War. He's major with Stonewall Jackson's division in 1862 there. He survives the war, and after the war is back teaching at the Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia, and is one of the most prominent voices against the voting rights of formerly enslaved people, against the education of formerly enslaved people, against the taxation of the former slave owners in order to pay reparations and create a more equitable system. On issue after issue, he continues to fight, and to fight with this very narrative that he says is the key to maintaining the slave system as it existed. It's the key to maintaining white supremacy. To imagine that America is somehow uniquely placed in the world as a redeemer nation, and that connection between God's providence and the systems that were established here as ordained by God, to establish that as God's purposes and God's mission, and to confront anyone who challenges that system and the way it has abused and used other people as anti-Christian. That is the strategy that Dabney develops, and that becomes, I think, so crucial to the way slaveholder religion has continued on down to the present. As you all know, Reconstruction only lasted a dozen or 13 years before the Klan, along with the bulldozers and the red shirts and other terrorist organizations, were able to so intimidate and in some cases overthrow local democratically elected governments, that they ran the federal troops out of the South. The compromise that allows Rutherford B. Hayes to become president in 1877 is a compromise that includes removing federal troops from the South, and marks the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the period that historians still name with a theological term. They call it the Redemption period. And they do that simply because that is the language that was being used, because of the theology and the tactics of people like Dabney. They proclaimed that the South had to be redeemed. The country had to be redeemed from northern aggression, as they said it, and from, this is their language, Negro rule, the danger of Negro rule. By that, they simply meant formerly enslaved Black men, in this case, having the right to vote, and pairing their vote together, often in fusion coalitions, with poor white people in the South, and changing the government, changing it in significant ways that expanded public education, that changed the tax code, that in some cases put corporations and railroads responsible for a greater portion of the public goods that they were using in order to make their fortunes. All of this was pushed back against by this so-called redemption movement. And by the time we get to Thomas Dixon, this is a novel that Thomas Dixon wrote in the early 20th century. Dixon is the grandson of a North Carolinian who was an officer in the Confederate Army. He grows up in North Carolina, in Shelby, North Carolina, ends up going to Johns Hopkins University. He comes back to North Carolina, is ordained as a Baptist preacher, and serves in the state legislature. Thomas Dixon is such a celebrated preacher. He's sort of a Billy Graham, a generation ahead of his time. He goes from pulpits in North Carolina to New York City and establishes one of the first mega churches in New York City. He rented out a big theater and had a church there. Was so successful in New York City that he ends up leaving the church and going on the Chautauqua circuit of the time, which I guess is closest equivalent to the Chautauqua circuit today is the cable news networks. I mean, it was just, the most sort of popular form of public conversation and reflection at the time. And he becomes a very famous novelist and writes a series of novels retelling the story of Reconstruction and redemption. The most famous of those novels becomes The Klansman. It says it right there, an historical romance of the Ku Klux Klan. He valorizes these men who rose up and overthrew the governments that were elected by Black and white people together in the South. He celebrates them as redeemers of not only the South, but of the nation. And he eventually gains the attention of D.W. Griffith in Hollywood, who is beginning to make, a big splash with major motion pictures. And he turns this story into the movie The Birth of a Nation. And Dixon, who had been a college buddy of Woodrow Wilson when he was at Johns Hopkins, by the time the movie comes out, his old college friend is in the White House and invites him to have a showing of this film in the White House. And so in 1917, at the seat of American power, you have this telling of America's history in which this redemption narrative that is steeped in this slaveholder religion, that is steeped in this distortion of Christian faith to justify slavery, becomes a popular way of telling how America came to be. The Birth of a Nation. It is an identity formation at its most fundamental sense. A few points I just want to highlight in terms of what this white Christian redemption narrative affirms. There is always this city on a hill exceptionalism, right? That God is doing something unique in the American story, and that whatever genocide or abuse of other people may have muddied it up, that this is God's mission, and that becomes a justification for whatever has to happen. There's over and over again an association of racial hierarchy with moral order, right? This is a huge part of what the redemption narrative pushes back on during the period of Reconstruction, that racial equity, that any attempt to equalize protection under the law, to equalize voting rights, to equalize access to public education, racial equity leads to corruption and immorality. It's described that way. It's imaged that way. There's all sorts of cartoons and such from the era that suggest that as Black people gain political power, that white women are in danger, right? That there's corruption in government, and that money is being stolen. These associations abound, not only in the movies like The Birth of the Nation, but in cartoons that were in newspapers, in stories that were told, from pulpits, and in popular writings of the time. There's the challenges to racial hierarchy are framed as socialist and anti-God. Over and over again, Dabney's tactic is adopted by the whole redemption movement, that it's an attack on God and an attack on the country to try to challenge racial hierarchy. And finally, this framing, this myth always suggests that there is a moral obligation to, quote, take back our country. That comes straight from the redemption movement, but it echoes again and again. It echoes in the reaction against the civil rights movement in the mid-20th century. This sense from Southern ministers and Southern politicians that Northerners were coming in to try to take our way of life, to take our country, and that we have to take it back. And it's certainly strong in the themes of the Tea Party and in the rise of birtherism and of Donald Trump's campaign in 2015, this call to take back our country, to quote unquote, make America great again. It's a through line that runs from the myth of a Redeemer nation in the mid-19th century all the way up to the Christian nationalism of today. So I wanted to share with you a couple of weeks ago. Some of us put out, I don't know if you all saw it, but there was a statement called "Say No to Christian Nationalism." And when we did that, we had a press conference, and Reverend William Barber, who is the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign today, spoke to this group of mostly white clergy who had come together to say no to Christian nationalism. And I thought what he had to say to fellow clergy about the importance of this kind of statement in our moment is important in terms of this long racist history that we've just covered. So this is just a couple minutes, but I wanted to play it here.
The attempts of those who try to hijack Christianity with this notion of religious nationalism, and they use it to undergird violence, undergird greed, undergird racism, undergird and promote programs and policies that hurt the poorest, the sickest among us. Well, members of the media, please hear this. This is not a debate about left Christianity and right Christianity. There is no such biblical debate. There is no such argument in Orthodox theology. That language is not our language. This is a challenge and a battle between heresy and the truths of God, between theological malpractice and the authentic practice of Christianity. The problem with so-called right Christian nationalism or white religious nationalism, whatever face is put on it, the problem with it is Jesus himself. It has no Jesus in it.
Come on.
It has no Jesus in it. They use Christ, but it has no Christ in it. It in no way aligns up with Jesus's clear instruction to the nations. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? And so it is an aberration because that's their problem. Call the name of Jesus with their mouths. Their actions are far from it, which makes it heretical, theological malpractice, that we have a loving, truthful obligation and an anointing of the Spirit to challenge them. Not because we hate them, but because it is the ultimate sin to try to take the glory of God and use it for your own gruesome purposes. God bless you. For the attempts of...
I appreciate his exhortation because it's as clear as Douglass's dichotomy, right, between the Christianity of slaveholders and the Christianity of Christ. It's he's drawing a distinction between true Christian faith and heresy, as he says, and I think that kind of clarity is incredibly important. But I think that this history that we've been looking at helps us to see that that the lack of clarity on just this issue in so many predominantly white Christian communities has everything to do with race. And so I think interrogating this history of slaveholder religion and the way it has influenced Christian faith and practice for people who are raised as white in this country is a huge part of what it means to address Christian nationalism. So to wrap up today, I said last week that I want to conclude each of these sessions with a biblical passage that I think helps us to sort of frame the context and sociology and history that we're looking at within the biblical story. I wanted to turn to the New Testament and look at 2 Peter chapter 2, because I think Peter, writing to the church, has just this kind of clarity on the sort of distinctions that we have to make, and a kind of realism about what some people are always willing to do with our faith. So in 2 Peter, it says, looking back, he's remembering, in his own time, historical periods from the past. And he says, there were also false prophets among the people, just as there will be, looking forward, false teachers among you. They will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the sovereign Lord who bought them, bringing swift destruction on themselves. Many will follow their depraved conduct and will bring the way of truth into disrepute. In their greed, These teachers will exploit you with fabricated stories. Their condemnation has long been hanging over them, and their destruction has not been sleeping. It says a little further down in the 9th verse, if this is so, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to hold the unrighteous for punishment on the day of judgment. I appreciate the realism of the scriptures here, that that this use and abuse of faith to prop up injustice is not a new thing. It's not a new thing in the history of the world. It's not a new thing within the biblical story. But there is a confidence there in Second Peter. Of course, Second Peter is the text that tells us that with God, 1,000 years is as a day, and a day is as 1,000 years. It might feel like this is going on a long time. It might feel like that the distortions are all out of whack, and the people with the loudest microphones are proclaiming things that just aren't true. But Peter says, hold on. This has happened in the past. It'll happen again in coming days. But what we know is that God is faithful, and God is able to keep those who hold true to his word, no matter who has power and no matter who looks like they're winning in the moment. So I'll stop there and open up the conversation. Steve, who's queued up to go first?
At this point, Jonathan, we don't have any questions. I just asked folks to write questions into the chat. So,
okay, well, if you want to just unmute yourself and you can comment, talk about what this looks like in your context, or raise a question.
Jonathan, this is David Haley. I found it remarkable that you trace that history of the taking our country back, that it goes back to the redemption period following Reconstruction and so forth. As I listened to you, it struck me that what I kind of considered to be sort of a new cry among people of, they're fearing they're losing their country and so forth, really goes that far back and so forth. And that was just remarkable to me. So I have a question for you. I heard Susan Page the other day from USA Today say that in their polling, 30%, they found that 30% of Americans in the past year have begun to rethink their views on racism, police, law enforcement, and social justice. When I heard her say that, I felt encouraged. And then I thought, well, that's still a pretty small percentage of, I'm wondering about, have you found that to be sort of the same sort of percentage that might have been rethinking it in the historical time when some of this was going on at that point?
Oh, it's a great question. I do think that it's the first point you're making, that much of what we see today echoes through this history, I think is critical for us to understand, because I think it keeps us from thinking that it's about a particular personality, or that it's a particular, political moment, a crisis within a party, or that sort of thing. These patterns run through our history and are much broader than that. And so the question you ask about what can we learn from other moments in terms of the degree to which people are or were rethinking their views on these things. My view on this is really profoundly shaped by the work of Ibram Kendi. I would recommend his work to you all as someone who has thought carefully about the role that race has played throughout American history. He won the National Book Award a few years ago for his history called Stamped from the Beginning. And he actually begins Stamped from the Beginning with a history of slaveholder religion in Massachusetts, and tells a good bit of Cotton Mather's story, who I mentioned earlier. But Ibram's broad point on racism is that it is the story we have told ourselves about race, he says, is a story that was told to justify a particular way of using other people's bodies. And he says that that the ideas, all of the racist ideas, are dependent on the system of exploitation, right? So often, I think we assume that the ideas come first and led to the system, but he kind of turns that on its head and says, actually, most of these ideas, most of the ways we have of justifying it, of describing it, come about as a way of helping people make sense of a system that is and justify it as good. And so Kendi really firmly believes that what he calls anti-racist work has to be about making systems more equitable so that people can live within a system where the outcomes for racial groups are not as extreme as they are. Because as long as those different outcomes exist, people will come up with new ways of saying, you know, why that's the way it is. It'll be because God made it that way, or it'll be because, you know, there's certainly a long period of scientific racism in this country where we use science. You know, it's the difference in brain size. It's the difference in, I mean, back in the 80s, we had the bell curve, and, you know, over and over again, there will be ways of describing, naming, and justifying inequality as long as there's a system that creates inequality, Ibram Kendi says. And so when I think about, you know, this question of how flexible are people, how much are people willing to reshape their thoughts, their positions on this, I think human beings are incredibly flexible. I think there's probably 40 to 60% of the population at any time that could change their views on something. But it's largely not going to happen by arguing them into a new position. I think it has to happen by beginning to change structures so that people can see that the world could be a different way. And so I think when it comes to the church, that means that we have to, while we walk with people, while we, you know, talk to them about their ideas, while we introduce them to new concepts, I think we have to be committed to more equitable systems if we want to see people's ideas change about race and about how they connect their faith to race. But thank you for the question. I think it's a good
Jonathan, the next one is from Deborah Stroman.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you so much for this very, very enlightening and engaging series. So I'm thinking about Christianity. For all of its complexity, it's rather simple. Or I should say the Christianity that I understand, that you accept Jesus Christ as your Savior. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on, perhaps because it is so simple, that a person can be a Christian and accept Jesus Christ, and then there's nothing else. So you can do whatever you want, you can say whatever you want, you can feel a certain way, but you've got Christ now. So I would love for you to speak on that. And I guess really what I'm talking about is faith and works.
Yeah.
But how people can continue to do what they do and not want to change or be flexible because they have Christ.
Well, I think you're already putting your finger right on it. I mean, the free gift of grace makes faith look simple, I suppose, on the front end. And in a sense it is, right? It's available to every one of us. But if you're going to actually live this thing, you know, the epistles say you're going to have to work it out with fear and trembling. it's going to throw you to the mat every day. So to the extent that any of us loses perspective on that, I think we're selling what the tradition has called discipleship short, right? This process by which grace is made manifest in our flesh and in our communities, right? This is not just about any individual. This is about how do we flesh it out, as people, and that certainly is about the life and the witness of congregations, but it's also about what we have to say about how our society should treat people, and so it shapes all the parts of our lives. And I think that that holistic sense of what it means to work out our faith with fear and trembling is a critical piece that we have to learn from those who have always offered a counter witness to slaveholder religion. I mean, the very notion that you can somehow separate your personal salvation from the status of your sister or brother in the world is right there in that Virginia Code in 1667, right? That distinction gets made within slaveholder religion, but it's antithetical to Christianity. I think we just have to be clear. There ain't no way to follow Jesus and not be concerned about the status of your sister and brother in the world. That's what James says. You mentioned James, right? That's James's, how are you going to say be warm and well fed and then, not help somebody who's cold and hungry? That's basic Christian. That's just as basic as have you asked Jesus into your heart, and that we've been able to separate the two, I think is a testament to the influence that slaveholder Christianity continues to have in the 21st century. So thank you for raising that.
Thank you.
David Greer is next.
Hello, David. Are you unmuted?
Yeah, I just unmuted
There
there. It just seemed to me, my question was, it seemed to me that this presentation could almost as equally be entitled The Economic Roots of Christian Nationalism, going back to the economic justification for the Virginia.
Yes, indeed.
And I'm curious, if you think that one precedes the other, or what's the relationship between those two roots, the racism and the economic imperative?
Oh, racism in America is economic, down to the core. Absolutely. Along the lines of what I was saying from Kendi's work earlier, you and I don't become white, and folks who are racist as black don't become black without plantation capitalism, right? These are ideas that were developed to keep the system running. What we're going to talk about next week is how in the 20th century, the narrative of Christian nationalism actually became less explicitly about race and more about economics. And that in large degree was a corporately sponsored project that was aimed at pushing back against the New Deal. So I'm going to tell you that story next week, but it's absolutely economics all the way through.
And to what degree do you think Americans are aware of that?
Sadly, not too aware. I don't think. No, I think there's a lot of, and I think that's, I think the church has a responsibility for that. I mean, to honestly grapple with the prophets and with Jesus is to recognize that idolatry is the primary sin, and that idolatry is always connected to greed, right? That's all through Scripture. And I don't think we in the church have taught that very well, because I don't think, as Douglass made clear, I don't think the $5,000 divines have ever had much incentive to preach against greed. we prefer our 401k over what the Lord doth say. And I think we got to be honest about that, because what it has led to, not just now, but age after age, what it has led to is real consequences for lots of people, for lots of people who are exploited and used because the prophetic ministry of the church has been very muted on these economic issues.
Thank you.
The next
It's
person
why we're having this
is
fight. I'll just say
Cheryl.
it's why we're having this fight about the $15 minimum wage right now, right? I mean, this is a fundamental moral question. Should anyone work all week long and at the end of the week, when they get their paycheck, not be able to afford a place to live and food to feed their family? That's a basic moral question. The answer is obviously no. But everybody knows that's been the reality. When the March on Washington happened in 1963, they were asking for $2 an hour. With inflation, $2 an hour today is $15 an hour. The moral movement for economic reform in this country for 60 years has been making this demand. And we keep saying, oh, that's the radical request, that's the left wing, that's the whatever name it gets given. No, that's just a basic moral demand. We've allowed that thing to be poorly framed. I'm sorry, I'm on a soapbox, Brother Steve. You had somebody else queued up.
Hi, Jonathan. It's wonderful to be with you this afternoon. And
oh, good to see you.
It's great to see you.
Yeah,
great to see you as well.
Square, yeah.
Great to see you as well. We know that there are many ways that this information is continues to be insidious and pervasive, in the system, this hypocrisy. And I'm wondering, to your knowledge, how much of what you're sharing with us is being taught in the seminaries and divinity schools across this country. Now, we know, that there are those that lean conservative, others that are more progressive, but do you see some transformation in some of the curriculum? Because certainly that is a place where we, those of us who are in divinity school, need to be wrestling. We need to be wrestling then, as well as in our church, as well and in the community and how we become involved. But we need to be wrestling with these issues there. Thank you.
Well, I talk to pastors all the time who tell me, we didn't deal with this in seminary. We dealt with church history, sort of broadly conceived. We dealt with lots of doctrinal questions, lots of pastoral questions. Didn't deal with this fundamental history of how Christianity has been misused. I think to the extent that it gets addressed in our seminary curriculums, this is mostly put under the category of public theology. But too often, we've accepted this, you mentioned it, this kind of left-right framework, this, progressive to conservative. And the church, of course, is always going to come in and say, well, we're not going to take sides, right? We're going to be a church for all people when you create a spectrum like that. But the church through history has been clear that, whatever the thought of the day on how things get worked out might be, there are always fundamental moral questions, right? And so I think the moral compromise of Christian communities on so many issues and our willingness to sort of allow them to be diffused through this kind of left-right dichotomy that we have in our society is a fundamental issue. So it's something we're going to continue to address here over the next few weeks. And I appreciate you raising it because we need more and more of it. And I hope you all are bringing it at least to the folks in your community and in your congregations where you are.